it in the email, but yes, we'll just go on from there. I think Pallavi started. So.
Okay. And did I already start?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hello and welcome to our 6th session in our series titled Negotiating Digital Space in Culturally Significant Storytelling. I hope everyone is having a great day so far. And so just a little bit about our session, about our series. It's called Negotiating Digital Space in Culturally Significant Storytelling, and it is conceived as a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary webinar series, which is organized by the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats in association with the Bachelor of Media Production and Design program at the School of Journalism in Carleton University in Ottawa, along with the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College, also in Ottawa. So this is a 7-part series, and it is supported by a SSHRC Connections grant. We are on our 6th webinar today, and we started on June 16th, and our final webinar takes place on July 28th, 2 days from now. We have been exploring the multifaceted concept of storytelling and how digital technology is expanding on the storytelling kit. This is a series that is co-curated by Katie Graham and myself, Pallavi Swaranjali. So it is my utmost pleasure to welcome David Dury and Vincent Andrisani for the session today, which is titled Soundscapes and the Story of Place. An exciting session today. We know storytelling often comprises an auditory component when narrated orally or when accompanied by music, drumming, or digital decibels or bytes. Soundscapes may acquire a spatial dimension, contributing to stories of space and spatialization of stories, eventually characterizing urban landscapes and communities. So in today's session, Vincent and David will discuss the opportunities and challenges of documenting and designing urban acoustic environments with emerging tools and technologies, which open up possibilities of realistic acoustic simulation and oralization, facilitating immersive recording and reproduction of acoustic environments, soundscapes, and stories of places. So welcome, David and Vincent. Thank you for being here. I will hand over to Katie now for the introduction of the speakers and the format of our webinar today.
Yes, thank you very much, Pallavi. So I'd like to introduce both Vincent and David. I'm going to read both of their bios, and then I'll pass over the sharing Zoom screen to Vincent, who will present for 20 minutes, then followed by David, and then we'll have conversations and discussion. I know today the audience right now is small, so it might be more of a conversation than answering questions, but if you do have questions in the audience, please share. And just as a note, even if the audience is small now, it will be larger after the fact through the recorded lecture on YouTube. So first, Vincent Andrisani. He is an instructor in the Communication and Media Studies program at Carleton University, and he specializes in area of sound studies, intersecting the fields of soundscape studies, oral history, and popular music studies. Media production is an important dimension of Vincent's research and teaching, and he presently produces a radio show called The Place of Sound, which you can follow at theplaceofsound.ca. And this showcases the audio media productions from his classrooms. Then David Dury studied electroacoustic composition at Concordia in Montreal and the SARC Queen University in Belfast. His master's thesis explored the way in which soundscape contributes to a sense of place through location-based sonic experiences. Since 2008, he has been working as a musical director, composer, and creative sound designer as the head of Montreal-based Dublin Studios. The studio specializes in creating immersive soundtracks for both traditional media, film, television, theater, and a wide array of public installations ranging from large-scale projections, mapping shows, to bespoke interactive installations. His work has been shown on 4 continents and been awarded several prizes, including the prestigious Golden Nika from Ars Electronica and 2 Gemini Awards. So I wanted to welcome both of you. I find this, before we start, I just find this session really interesting because sound's never something that I've paid much attention to, but whenever I am with either one of you, I get more of an appreciation for sound. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass over the screen sharing to Vincent, and you may begin.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Pallavi. Thanks so much to the both of you for the invite. I'm really excited, as I mentioned, to participate in this session and to learn more about David and his work. So, okay. So I want to begin by acknowledging that the institution I work at, Carleton University, and the city of Ottawa are located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Algonquin people. And I'm coming to you today from the city of Winnipeg, which is the home of the Métis Nation, taking a moment to offer our gratitude as uninvited guests on these landscapes is an important way to begin most any session, but it's particularly salient today when the present dialogue will deal not only with sound and storytelling, but also the topic of place and the politics of living and being in and on a particular geography. Today, I'd like to share a few thoughts about audio media storytelling, and in doing so, I'll speak specifically to some of the many possibilities that it presents. But before I do that, I'll quickly say a few words about my approach as a sound studies researcher, practitioner, and educator. Let me just set this thing up here. Yeah. Okay, so for those who are unfamiliar, sound studies is a field of study that extends across the humanities and social sciences that asks questions about sound and listening and their relationship to broader social, economic, and technological systems. My work explores the relationship between sound and space, and in particular, I'm interested in cities, in urban spaces. And so my work is animated by the following question: what can we learn about the city if we think of it not on visual terms, but on sonic terms? We tend to think of architecture, urban planning, and so on as visual projects. But what if we thought about them with and through our ear? And accordingly, my work circulates not only as written documents like journal articles and as chapters in edited collections, but it also takes the shape of audio media as well. I've produced audio documentaries, soundscape compositions, oral history vignettes, and as an educator, I center audio media production in my teaching. I produced a radio show, as Katie mentioned, and a podcast titled The Place of Sound that airs every other Monday on CKCU-FM, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts. I get a little plug in there. So that's a bit about me and the work that I do, which sets up my exploration of the challenges and possibilities of not just using sound, but of thinking sonically in the context of place-based storytelling. And I'm going to do this by covering 3 key points. The first of which is listening. Audio-based storytelling is, of course, a matter of technological mediation, but I want to go one step further, or maybe one step back, to consider the ways that we listen and how it's brought to bear in the media that we produce. The second of which is thinking about context. How do we as sound practitioners both make sense of and account for the multiple and oftentimes competing histories that converge in the geographies in which we work? And the third deals with the ways that we narrativize our experience and our knowledge of place. How do we put all this into a story? And what are our obligations as storytellers? Now here, I'll offer a quick example from my work in the city of Havana, Cuba, and I'll say a few words about what it might mean in terms of audio storytelling more broadly. But before beginning, I must say that I have more questions than I do answers in all this, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. The hope is then that this talk itself offers an engaging story about sound and storytelling, and that I'm able to raise some interesting and provocative questions along the way. Okay, there's a common tendency to discuss audio storytelling as a practice that begins and ends with technology. And to be sure, understanding media technologies are a central part of this creative practice. For instance, how do we use the microphone as a tool with which to explore the world around us? Even though it may seem straightforward enough, there are, of course, techniques that guide our use of the microphone while field recording, which in many ways acts as an extension of the ear. We can, for instance, bring the mic right up against a sound source to isolate a given sound, or we can move it farther away in order to capture a more comprehensive perspective of the location. We can stand in a fixed position, or we can move around a space and explore it in much the same way that a camera frames the world in the form of a photograph or a video that is, emphasizing some subjects at the expense of others. The microphone also frames an experience of a given place. However, and I intend to be somewhat provocative when I say this, audio storytelling isn't about technology, and in particular, it doesn't begin with what we do with the microphone. Instead, audio storytelling and composition begins even before we grab the recorder, because it's about the ways that we listen. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that sonic composition is more an expression of one's listening than it is an expression of sound-based production. So how do we listen? How should we listen? With what ears do we listen? What do we hear? What do we want to hear? Now, it's important to note that there are a number of schools of thought on the topic of listening, each of which theorizes it in a different way. And the approach that I tend to lean on is some combination of soundscape studies and cultural geography, which we can get a better sense of by asking the following questions. For example, can we listen to the sonic environment melodically? Can we listen rhythmically? That is, can we listen musically to everyday sounds in order to hear the soundscape as a composition? Can we listen typologically? That is, can we think about categorizing the sounds we hear? For instance, human sounds, mechanical sounds, natural sounds, and so on. Or can we listen historically? This is a question that I tend to pursue in my work because it's a first step in building the context we need to better understand place. So for instance, when listening, I'll often ask the following questions. Which sounds have been heard in a given location for an extended period of time? That is to say, which sounds are old sounds? Which are new sounds? Or conversely, can we imagine the sounds that were once heard in a given location but have since been silenced? Now, by no means, of course, is this list exhaustive. There are an infinite number of ways of attending to the sounds of the sonic environment. But the key is that each one asks us to think through a given theme while listening, that it pushes us to not just take stock of the sounds themselves, but to try and find some meaning in them. And for the type of storytelling that I do, situating my listening in a broader social and historical context is critical. In fact, we might argue that listening in general is an exercise in hearing context, in how we connect the particular to the whole, how we understand the relationship between the micro and the macro. It's about making connections where it may otherwise seem like there are none. Now, when exploring place, hearing context happens by thinking through space itself, in further situating ourselves as listeners in time and place. This move toward establishing a greater sense of spatial context is guided by the following question. What histories are brought to bear on the ways we experience place in the present moment? Which is to say, why is it designed in the way that it is? Where do place names come from? And who or what governs this space? Now, the answers to these questions offer a sense of how power is or is not distributed based on who is included and who is excluded in a given geography's process of decision-making. So in order to answer the question, how do we listen? We need not only a theory of listening, but we also need a theory of space, which allows us to build in social and historical context. Once we do that, we'll be able to listen to the sonic environment with new ears, so to speak. So to do this, I look to the field of cultural geography, and in particular, I look to the work of geographer Doreen Massey. Massey observes that, quote, places can be imagined as articulated moments in networks of social relations and understandings, but where a large proportion of those relations, experiences, and understandings are constructed on a far larger scale than what we happen to define for that moment as the place itself. Massey talks about the outward lookingness of space, which is to say that it's comprised of more abstract temporalities and spatialities that condition the ways we experience it. Temporal, in the sense that, quite simply, space is historical. It's changed over time, and each distinct era is in some way inscribed into the landscape. We just need to know how and where to look or listen for it. And spatial, in the sense that space is relational, which is to say that localized spaces are always related to other spaces. What happens in one place is contingent upon what's happening elsewhere. This has been particularly the case over the 20th century in the context of global modernity, where spaces are in no way separate and isolated, but are defined by the many flows of people, finance, and material objects that move through them. And so, just as Doreen Massey calls for the outward lookingness of space, I do the same for listening, and I ask us to listen for its outward soundingness. Doing so enables us to listen to space in ways that extend beyond the space itself. It allows us to connect the sounds of the immediate environment to broader histories and to places elsewhere. But in order to hear this context, we ourselves need to be open to learning and listening for stories that sit outside normative understandings of place. We need to be open to listening for stories that might otherwise be overlooked and silenced. So how do we do this? Well, this is a question that I hope to answer by way of example. An important part of my research is based in and on the city of Havana, Cuba. I've spent a good amount of time living there as both a visitor and in the capacity of a researcher. I've worked with local scholars, cultural organizations, and my main project was one that focused on the city's sound environment, its soundscapes. Now, Havana is a big city, as you can see here, and its soundscape is comprised of millions of sounds that are constantly coming and going. So it's impossible to talk about the Havana soundscape as this single thing, just as it's impossible to talk about any city's soundscape. So what I did was I focused on a series of sounds that captured my attention. And like any good researcher, I followed my curiosity to learn more about them, to hear them in new ways, and by bringing my localized experience in touch with broader, more abstract narratives about the city. One of those sounds was the sound of dripping water. Each day in the neighborhood that I lived in, the sound of dripping water woke me up as it landed on the air conditioner in the window that was right above my head. For the first little while, I thought I was hearing this sound because it was raining outside, but eventually I realized that it was coming from the building itself. Atop the roof, there's this reservoir that stores the potable water for all the apartments in the building, and it gets filled by one of the residents who lives on the top floor nearest to it. He turns on the mechanical pump in the basement, which pushes the water up through the pipes, filling the reservoir. Now, this process usually takes a couple of hours from beginning to end, depending on how much water was used by residents throughout the day. The problem is that the float ball assembly inside the reservoir is broken. When it's working, it automatically turns off the pump. But replacement parts are scarce, and so it's remained broken for some time, leaving it up to the resident himself to turn off the pump at the precise moment that it's full. Now, this is a difficult, if not impossible, task, and so inevitably the water overflows, it spills onto the rooftop, and it then finds its way to drainage pipes and spills down over the side of the building. And my bedroom was on its way down, so that's what made the dripping sound that woke me up every morning. It was the overflowing water. Now, the bigger problem is that once the water reaches the ground level, it then floods the laneway, making it completely unusable. Now, this wouldn't be too much of an issue, but there's a home next door, and someone's apartment opens up right into the laneway. Not only that, but they also hang their clothes to dry right in the spot that the water falls. So this is a real nuisance for them. Now, all of this that I'm explaining to you here in this localized environment is in step with one of the central narratives that surround the city of Havana, which is that it's currently in a state of decay, that it's a city with old architecture that hasn't been maintained and it's presently falling into disrepair. The water delivery system loses more than 50% of its water before it even reaches residents because of cracks in the network. Now, this explains the need for a mechanical pump in the basement of the building. The network doesn't have enough pressure to get the water up to the rooftop. And the city is overpopulated, and it faces a severe housing crisis, which explains the makeshift apartment that opens up into the laneway in the building next door. Now, the state of the city today pushed me to consider how it got that way by asking, what's the history of Havana's built environment? And answering that question pointed me towards spaces that I never really considered when I encountered these sounds, the sounds of dripping water, in the context of everyday life. For instance, Havana's historical districts and older neighborhoods were built during the Spanish colonial era, which ran from the 15th to the 19th century. Much of the outskirts of the city were built during the 20th century, when the city was under US influence. Now, this also happens to be the moment that the water delivery network was built, which was a project largely funded by American investors. And then there's the revolutionary period, which began in 1959 and was led by a socialist government that prioritized the development of the island's interior over its cities. The result is that Havana has been left in a state of decay and disrepair. Now, this has given life to readings of the city that have argued that its lack of maintenance and ruination are symbolic of the declining political agency of the local population. So long as residents are surrounded by ruin, some authors maintain, they will be unable to imagine and effect emancipatory change. But this isn't the end of the story, because it's also in sound and listening that residents enact an entire sequence of events that mitigate and at times can even prevent the daily overflow. Through the open windows of their home, residents listen actively outside the limits of the home to the activity of the neighborhood. They're aware when the mechanical pump is filling the reservoir, and they listen for the water when it begins spilling out into the laneway. And the moment that it does, they begin shouting up to the reservoir custodian to let him know that the reservoir is full and it's begun overflowing. He then promptly acknowledges and immediately turns off the pump, bringing the episode to an end. Now, this sequence demonstrates not only an acute and really sophisticated oral awareness that's sensitive to the sounds of flowing water, but there's obviously a really strong communal sensibility around it as well, as they acknowledge that this is a terrible nuisance for the folks who live on the ground floor in the laneway. The collective aim is to help mitigate the daily disruption by bringing it to an end as quickly as possible. So what I did as someone who was very curious about all this is I followed the sequence with my microphone, close miking it at various points along the way. I captured the sounds of the mechanical pump, the filling reservoir, the rooftop overflow, the laneway flooding, and of course, the residents all chiming in to capture the attention of the reservoir custodian. And I developed not only an academic article about it, but also an audio documentary, the latter of which expands my academic thinking, giving it a new dimensionality and ultimately making these ideas richer. The name of the project is Se Bota el Tanque, which is it's the phrase that residents yell to alert one another that the reservoir is overflowing. And if you're interested in having a read or listen, you can scan the QR code and it'll take you directly to the website where it's been published. Okay, so why is this story important? Well, in an immediate sense, it's a story about this neighborhood and its water delivery infrastructure. It communicates the difficulty that these residents face as a result of their malfunctioning reservoir. But in a more abstract sense, it's a story about space, about the infrastructural networks of the city and the convergence of the many histories that make up everyday life in Latin American cities today. But most of all, this is a story about the resilience of residents themselves. It intervenes with broader narratives that position the city as one that's falling into ruin. Instead, it centers residents themselves based on their ingenuity, their community, and communication. And this is a story that can be accessed only in and through sound and listening, but not just listening to the immediate sounds themselves. It requires listening for both spatial and historical context in order to access what Doreen Massey calls the networks of social relations that give life to this localized moment. It requires listening to what we might call the outward soundingness of space to consider Cuba's interior provinces, the island's relationship to the United States, and even its colonial history with Spain during the early years of the city. So I want to end by considering the question, what are our obligations as storytellers. What stories do we tell? Sound and listening allow us to reframe the ways that we think about spaces. They allow us to encounter them in new ways, in ways that we otherwise tend to overlook. And because of this, we're able to look and listen beyond the normative stories that circulate by thinking with and through modes of communication that often escape our analysis. We're able to revisit history in new ways and make links between spaces that otherwise may seem unrelated. All of this is to say that we're able to listen from the perspective of those who are not centered in stories. We're able to hear space from the margins. And when we do that, we can intervene with existing narratives about society and the institutions that comprise it. In this sense, there's a potential for hope, for change, not just in audio media storytelling, but in the very ways that we listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very exciting. Although I have some questions and thoughts, I'm going to just quickly pass it over to David and let him take over presenting, and then we'll have a conversation afterwards. So David, all yours.
Hi, everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you, Vincent, for that. That was excellent. We can tell that Vincent is a skilled orator, used to presenting to audiences. I spend most of my days alone in a studio, so I may not be up to the same level, but I'm going to do my best. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the overarching concerns today, and then what I'm principally going to do is just run through some of the ways that my work and practice have intersected with some of those questions. So let me share my screen here. Okay. So Soundscape and the story of place. So we're starting with these sort of fairly hefty notions of story and place and sound. Place and space are two interrelated concepts. Vincent's very much sort of involved in the interrelation of these two, and a sort of cursory overview of some of the notions of what connect the two spaces give us these ideas that place is a space that imbues feeling, that has meaning, that is valued, or place is a space that you remember. And for me, if you sort of take a lot of these attributes as a whole, you get something that does resemble the notion that places are spaces that tell a story. Stories are the things that we remember. Stories are the things that imbue meaning and feeling. And so many of us who are working with this notion of place are thinking naturally in this sort of storytelling vein. Now, my background particularly is in sound and in music. I came to sound not through a classical musical background. My first introduction was when I purchased a digital sampler way back in the late 90s. So I came right in a sort of experimental vein, thinking about sound as a recording medium and as a way to reorder and reconfigure recorded sound in musical and other sorts of contexts. I did a bachelor's degree at Concordia in electroacoustics, and then a master's degree in Northern Ireland at Queen's in Belfast. And by the time I got to the master's stage, I was thinking a lot about soundscape and about place. And at that stage, we were pre-smartphone. So we didn't have sort of highly sophisticated GPS-ready devices in our pockets, but we did have these early stages of GPS-enabled digital devices. I was specifically working on my master's project with a division of HP in Bristol, who had developed something called the Mobile Bristol Toolkit, which was essentially a little PDA, personal digital assistant, that was GPS enabled and would allow you to map sounds to a space. So someone could walk around carrying the device and then encounter your pre-recorded sound based on where they were within a mapped space. So I created one sound map using this technology in the context of my master's thesis, a little of my story. And I then went on to create an additional piece using a similar technology a few years later, when I was invited back to commission a piece for a festival in Belfast. Immediately after graduating, I had a very formative artistic residency with a Spanish composer called Francisco Lopez, who was one of the figures, one of the artists that was responsible for really solidifying my interest in the notion of soundscape and the practice of soundscape in a compositional setting. Francisco Lopez is an ecologist, but also a widely known and extremely prolific sound artist. And he uses exclusively sort of recorded environmental sound as a basis for his sound art, for his compositional practice. But they're not soundscape compositions in the traditional sense. Some of them sound closer to a traditional soundscape composition, but they're quite abstract and they're quite powerful. And he gives these incredible concerts where all the participants are blindfolded and diffuses sort of an hour-long piece. And I was immediately just taken with and blown away by the incredibly visceral nature of this sound, which didn't resemble anything that I knew as music, even experimental music. And part of the reason for that was that it was very much grounded in soundscape recordings, in environmental sound. So in 2009, I was invited by Francisco to come take part in a residency in the Brazilian Amazon, where we spent a couple of weeks essentially doing recordings, doing field recordings. And I'd never experienced a sound environment, anything remotely close to the Brazilian Amazon. And it really sort of rearranged my conception of what soundscape is and of what being in a sound environment is. I'll play you just a little sort of excerpt here of some of the sound that was recorded during that residency. And then we can sort of come back to it a little bit later. So as you can hear, it's this just incredibly rich tapestry of interwoven sounds being produced by thousands and thousands of sources: insects, bird life, frogs, environmental factors like wind, rain, etc. And just an incredible, incredible sort of revelation to me about how sound works in that kind of context. I grew up in the city, I grew up in Montreal, and I had very much sort of been used to urban sound. And suddenly sort of this rearranged my thinking around the way that sound works as systems. The piece that I was invited back to present in Belfast in 2010 is a piece that I worked on there for about a month during a residency, using a mapping technology wherein I did recordings on either side of what are known somewhat euphemistically as the peace lines, which are these immense concrete barbed wire walls that separate Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods, traditionally at odds in Belfast. And what I did was a series of recordings on either sides of the peace line, either side of the peace lines, and then remap those using GPS technology to a neutral space, a green space in sort of central Belfast, neither Catholic nor Protestant, and then invited users to sort of walk through the neutral space and pass sort of freely between these two soundscapes that are generally separated by these concrete walls. I'll play you a quick excerpt of that. I'm realizing I'll probably run short on time, so I may cut it off before we get to the end, but to give you a little sense of it.
And the walls will never come down unless the walls come down in people's hearts. You know, and fear creates walls, and painful memories create walls.
Well, I work with lots of Catholics like Doran, two friends with me too. We're not all bad stuff.
Usually you need to spend lots of time with them. This is a baby one.
I'll cut that one there, but give you an idea of the sort of sounds environments that were captured on both sides. Again, quite rich environments. We're hearing sounds of voices, sort of excerpts of little stories, as well as you sort of heard the sort of fence being run over with a stick, which is a sort of a children's game, sounds of football being played, sounds of carrier pigeons. There's sort of a practice of keeping carrier pigeons. So again, sort of bringing this sort of set of separate soundscapes into one space and having them intermingle, and sort of seeing what was produced through that. A couple of years later, I produced another piece called Hearing There for the MUTEC Festival in Montreal. And again, I came back to this notion of experiencing sound spaces that we are removed from or occluded from. And what I did was took a set of interior spaces along Saint Laurent Boulevard, sort of the main thoroughfare in Montreal, and recorded excerpts of sound, both sort of soundscape style, some storytelling style, some more built up based on sounds that I had sampled within the space, and then had listeners and visitors walk up the boulevard and listen to the spaces from outside the spaces. So again, sort of playing with this notion of listening to a space that is not the space that we're occupying, but it is a space that is present for us. I'll play a quick sort of example of that one.
Building here, I think, close to 75 years. I might be wrong, but I know it's more than 55, 60 years. It's evolved differently with the time.
So what emerges there is oftentimes in terms of soundscape, we think about city sound. If we're taking the soundscape of St. Lawrence Boulevard, it's a fairly dense, noisy, combustion engine based kind of soundscape. But what happens in this context is that you're transported to all of these adjacent spaces, and there's an incredible sort of richness and connectivity that emerges in the kinds of spaces, whether it's a funeral home or a daycare or a pet store. One last project I'll just mention briefly from sort of the academia art practice realm is an installation that I did in 2015 called Once Removed, which actually used some of the sound that I had recorded several years previously in the Amazon. And I created a sort of sculptural piece of hundreds and hundreds of suspended earbuds, which was then diffusing some of this really fine, there were 12 channels of this really sort of fine Amazonian insect sound running through the earbuds. And on the one level, sort of sculpturally, aesthetically, it was sort of a comment or a questioning of this culture of mediated listening. We're all sort of walking around with these earbuds in our ears and creating our sonic environments through their intervention. But then on the other hand, it was also sort of this interesting equivocation of that dense Amazonian soundscape, which is produced by thousands and thousands of tiny little point sounds, creating a rich tapestry, and then actually using the earbuds not to put them in your ears, but using them as this sort of dense array of tiny point sounds and creating this actually really rich immersive environment through that. So moving on to sort of the other side of my work is the work that my studio does. So that is composing work, is commissioned work, is commercial work, in film, television, VR, installation, etc. But some of these same questions really run through a lot of the work that the studio encounters. A project that I worked on a few years ago with a director named Kalina Bertin was a project called Manic, and we created a virtual reality version of a documentary film that she had made about her father, who was manic depressive, and something that also ran through much of her family. And the challenge there was to sort of illustrate and dig into some of the spaces that were being described by Kalina, by her father, by her brother, in abstract kinds of ways, using elements of soundscape, using elements of music, using elements of sound design. So I'll play you a quick little example of just a screen capture from the VR experience here.
It's very poetic. I was taking photographs and I saw these ghosts in my room. I was visited by all these spirits, and it felt like I was like pausing time, and then it looked like the spirits, they were like looking back at me as if they were captured into this separate realm. And then I saw my room as like a jungle.
So again, there's this sort of rich evocation of interior space or imaginary space, but some of the same threads are being used in terms of how we're telling that story sonically. Very rarely, my more sort of commercial commissions overlap with some of the sort of soundscape work that I do. One case in which was I was commissioned by Aldo for their 40th anniversary to work on a soundscape piece, and they gave me access to their distribution factory here in Montreal. And it was an incredible experience. There were some really remarkable similarities to being in this large scale distribution factory to being in an environment like a tropical rainforest. I'll play a very quick example there of some of that sound. It opened with more soundscape and it gets into the more industrial stuff. So I think there's some really interesting questions there for me about, in what ways is that similar to a tropical rainforest, and in what ways is that fundamentally different? I'm running a little short on time, so I'll just sort of move quickly through a couple more. I worked on a project a few years ago for Canada's Parliament, for the Library of Parliament, where we created a VR experience. And again, we're sort of tasked with this notion of how do we sonically convey elements of this space? And we had narrative elements, which sort of brought some of the storytelling. And then we had sort of sound design elements and musical elements. And I'll maybe skip playing the example here just for time's sake, but we can come back to it later if we like. One last project I'd just like to mention, because it's a slightly sort of different angle. I've worked for years with a Montreal-based firm called Daily Tous les Jours, who do really interesting urban sound installations. And we worked on a project in 2017 in Mesa, Arizona, called Mesa Musical Shadows. And it was a commission from sort of a community center in Mesa to create an installation in sort of a concrete courtyard out in front of their main building. And so this is a case in which we were sort of tasked with imbuing a space with story that wasn't sort of pre-existing. I don't, if any of you have been to Mesa, it's sort of a suburb of Phoenix. It's quite sprawling. It's got, it doesn't have a ton of that sort of ingrained story sense to it. And so what we were trying to do with Musical Shadows was say, how can we take this sort of concrete courtyard and create a sound-based experiential thing that will evoke a sense of place, that will give this otherwise somewhat anonymous space some of that sense of place. So we created this sort of play grid with sensors embedded in the ground that are light sensors. So participants are playing the space with their shadow. So as their shadow moves across the sensor points, they're triggering various sounds and sequences of sounds, and their shadow is working in conjunction with other people's shadows throughout the space and creating not only a relation sort of personally with the other users, but with the place that they're in as well. And we used two types of sound here. One was human voice. So we wanted to use something that might be sort of unexpected in that sort of concrete courtyard circumstance, and also something that would sort of be immediately quite visceral, quite touching. So a lot of the sounds in the majority of the scenes were sort of based on the human voice. And then there was one other scene that comes on as we get towards sundown that is based on more of the soundscape sounds. So sort of like insects, sort of nocturnal sounds. And you're triggering these and sort of creating this sort of traditional southwestern desert soundscape with the long shadows that you're casting in the evening. I don't have a sound example here because it's not a composition, it's an instrument, in fact. So it's sort of something that's created as you go. And I think I'm just about at the end of my time, so I'll sort of wrap it up there. And we can then get into a deeper discussion with Vincent.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I know that Pallavi already has some things that she wants to ask. So before I ask my questions, I'm going to pass it to her. And I'll just say that anyone who is here can, who has a question can put it in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will read it out loud. So Pallavi, would you like to take point?
Sure. Thank you, Katie. And thank you for the fascinating presentations, Vincent and David. Really intriguing to hear about like soundscapes, because as Katie mentioned, we are probably very fixated to the visual image and to get over it and listen to the auditory is something that, you know, it happens, but probably we don't pay too much attention. So your work definitely brings the focus onto it. I was really intrigued by two things, actually, and let me ask that one by one. But both of you in some ways referred to listening from outside the space and listening from inside the space. And that really talks at various levels, you know, it's also a very objective, subjective kind of, if you want to draw that parallel. But what did you mean by listening from inside space and outside, and how do those differ probably in the examples that you showed to us? Maybe David, you're on.
Do you want to take a first crack at it?
Sure. I think on one level, in my case, it's a very literal consideration. I ask this question, you know, what does it mean to be in the present moment, listening to a space that is not the space that's surrounding you, which is, of course, something that we do all the time. Anytime we've got Spotify playing in our AirPods or whatever it is, we're listening to another space as we walk down the street, or we're listening to a podcast. But to bring a different kind of intentionality to that and say, what does it mean to be listening to the interior of that funeral home while you're standing out here on the street, or to be listening to what happens on the Protestant side of that wall while you're standing here in a space with Catholics and Protestants sort of moving through the space. And it's a question for me that is ongoing and sort of informs a lot of my sort of thinking and practice. And it's, I think, again, coming into, it helps me define this sort of relationship between place and space, and what the physical dynamic is in terms of when you're listening is not situated where you are, what happens there. And again, as Vincent said earlier, I don't necessarily have answers to a lot of these questions, but they're questions that I think are rich and worth asking. Maybe Vincent, you have more answers than I do.
Yeah, I don't know that I have answers, but I mean, I can ruminate on the idea. I think this speaks to one of the points that I was making in the talk, which is it's really difficult to have a theory of listening without having a theory of space, right? It's really difficult to say something meaningful about listening. I mean, I think one could, and I think people have, but in my approach, and I think it sounds like David and I share the approach, is that like we play with listening because we're playing with space, and vice versa. We're playing with space, and we play with space through listening. And so thinking about interiority, exteriority, localized, circumscribed sort of geographies, and geographies elsewhere, and different moments. Like, I mean, I think this is the fascinating point of listening. Like this is when listening becomes really interesting, is because we play with it in ways that point to the fact that it's contextual, right? This is happening here and now, but there are other things that are happening elsewhere now and in the past that that should inform how we do what we're doing here and now, which is to say listening, right? And so we can ask an infinite number of questions about our immediate experience. You know, it's not just the sound of an event. It's not just the sound of a car horn, but it's, you know, it's that relative to everything else, right? And we can say whatever we want about it as long as we're imagining, like it depends on what we imagine it to be, what we imagine the experience to be. And so for me, you know, I think about, okay, so we're here in this context, but what are the other things that had to happen for this sound to emerge here so I can hear it now? Right? Like, I mean, we're listening to the vents of our computers. Well, our computers are not from here. Our computers are from very far away, and they come as a result of the labor of people we don't know, and what are the routes that they took to get here, and how did they get, like, all of these things. It's like, well, we couldn't hear the fan in our computer if we didn't have all those other things, right? And so, you know, that's kind of like, these are the things that I think about when I think about, you know, listening here, listening there, listening, the outward soundingness of space, the historicity of sound, all of those things pushes us to think in these many different directions, which I think is the most exciting thing in the world, because we can take one sound and tell 30 stories about it, and or 300 stories about it, and all of them are equally useful, right? And which again points to the fact that, you know, I'll hear something and tell this story, and David will hear something and tell a completely different story, and we're hearing the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the last point that I'll make on this is the idea of, and I think, David, I'm sure you're familiar with it, the idea of the sound walk, which is the most telling instance of all of this, right? It's like the aim in a sound walk is painfully simple. People get together, walk in a predetermined route led by a sound walk leader, and nobody says anything. And then and we listen. And all you do is listen, and you arrive at the ending, and you debrief, and you talk with everyone, and all of a sudden you realize that, you know, person A heard 30 sounds that you didn't even realize were there, or you might have heard but you didn't notice, like you didn't really hear, or you didn't really capture the meaning. And it's in that dialogue that you realize, hey, we were all in the same place at the same time, walking the same route, presumably hearing the same sounds, but all of us have such different stories, like have such different things, observations that we've made, right? So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
And that's beautiful. And just to follow up, and that was probably the second thing that was going on in my head when I was listening to both of you talk, is storytelling. And especially Umberto Eco talks about, when he talks about stories, the idea of an author, the idea of a narrator. So the idea of an audience, actor, listener. There's so many parts that you can play when a story is being told, or you're listening to a story. And you were talking about, Vincent, when you talk about this, the sound walk that you just described, and everybody listening to different sounds, and, you know, paying particular attention to some and not to others, this idea of selective listening. And it's very subjective again. And I may hear something, you may not hear that, and depending on like what we've experienced in the past and so many other things, right? This idea of selective listening, how does digital technology affect that? Because, you know, when, say, if you are in a podcast or in one of your audio clips that we just listened to, there were certain digital accommodations made, probably so that some sounds are heard more or the others are not. So then being in a place physically versus listening to the sound of space digitally, which has been probably altered and modified, how do you think, I'm pretty sure there's a difference between that, or do you differ on that?
There's definitely a difference. I think there are two approaches, and there are a myriad of approaches, but two that sort of have principally informed the way I do things. One is I've traditionally done a lot of binaural sound recording, which aims essentially to capture the experience of the sound environment exactly as it's coming to my ears, and be able to ostensibly reproduce that for someone else. It'll never work perfectly because we have different heads and whatnot, but it can be remarkably good at giving someone the sense of being in the sound space that I had occupied. And it's quite an incredible tool. In a lot of other contexts, it is much more, and I work principally as a composer. So composing is also part of what I do. And that comes into work with Soundscape as well, because I am making choices about what sounds to include, how to layer them, how to sort of move from one sound to another. I'm not a big, I don't do a lot of manipulation of natural sound. But of course, I am making those sort of layering choices and sort of transitional choices. So I'm choosing how their story is unfolding. And I take that on. I'm making compositional decisions there. And I'm sort of, that's where my story is intersecting with the stories that I have taken from the sound environment or I have recorded in the sound environment. Vincent, thoughts?
Yeah, so there's one idea that came to mind after thinking about hearing maybe the question, Pallavi and David, where you took it. And Pallavi, let me know if I kind of answer this or if I don't. But I think the idea is like, how can sort of what we do in the digital world, how can it shape, enhance, maybe sharpen, change the ways that we listen in everyday life? Right? What's the sort of relationship between maybe mediated and non-mediated listening, I think was where you were getting at originally, right? And I think that, okay, awesome. And I think that there's a couple of ways of thinking about this. One of which is like the sort of popular notion that, headphone listening is dumbing down our listening, and that it's like, we're listening less and we have more to listen to and we're doing less listening than we ever have in the past. We look at our phones, which you can't, for some reason, is see-through here. Wow, that's weird. I'm holding a phone, everyone. Okay, there it is. We listen to our phones and we're listening to Spotify, we're listening to Apple Music, we have more music than we ever have, but we're doing less listening than we ever have, right? And this is a sort of moralizing technology and media. It's yeah, I'll leave it at that. But I mean, I think that the opposite, the complete opposite can be said at the same time, right? Which is precisely, I think, what the work that David is doing is about. It's actually about sharpening our hearing. It's about making us better listeners. And I think that one of the aims of soundscape composition, and David can, agree or disagree, but I think there are probably a handful of soundscape composers, more than a handful, that would say that's precisely their aim. Is to use composition, it's to use the tools of media to get us to listen different in our everyday lives, right? It's to get us to listen different when we take their earbuds out. So on the one hand, we have these two very, very different narratives that are kind of coming together. Media is making us, listen less and dulling our sense of hearing. But at the same time, there are composers who are saying, well, actually, my aim is precisely the opposite, right? Is to kind of refine our sense of hearing and refine our listening, and to be able to take the tools that we acquire when we listen to composition and turn them on everyday life and ask some similar questions about it, right? So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
I think that's spot on. I think that what happens often with that mediation is that, I'm thinking, when's the last time you listened to a pop song or a podcast where there was like real nuance and dynamics and sort of rich detail that you really sort of have to get in there to hear? It doesn't happen very often. We're sort of, the mediation that happens in terms of a lot of the audio that we're consuming is that it brings it to a level where you don't have to do any work. It's right there. It's hitting you over the head in terms of the audio, in terms of how it's digitally treated, etc. And I think exactly as Vincent was saying, the work that certain composers and soundscape composers are doing is saying like, okay, we can use that mediated space, but by telling you or giving you a different way of interacting with it, it will change the way you're listening. It will change your relationship to what you're doing with your ears and show you the potential of what you're doing with your ears in a different way.
I wanted to follow up kind of that conversation with something more related to David's work, which is the idea of the interaction with it and play, especially the soundscape, that the installation that you created with the shadows. And I think both of you can address this, but that idea of interaction and stuff, I think is so key to make people listen, to make people engage. And in fact, I can think, as I said earlier, that sound's never been something I've really paid much attention to. However, I can think of 2 different random installations in different cities that I've encountered like 15 years ago because it involved play and interaction. Like there's a swing set in Montreal. Maybe you remember this. It was a random swing set that if you swung in unison with the person next to you, it was
That's
this beautiful.
It's the same company that I worked with in Arizona. Yeah.
Okay. And I remember that so much because it was just this playing and interacting with it. So how important is that interaction? And does it, well, just more of what do you feel about the interaction of it? I'm gonna give it to David first.
I think it's an incredibly powerful tool. I think that Daily Tous les Jours, who is the company that I worked with in Arizona and I've worked on many projects with, and who also did that swing set that you remember in Montreal, at the core of what they do is that notion of play. So they're creating installations that are very much play-based. And I think that one thing that play does is it very immediately brings us into our body. It brings us into sort of a corporeal sensibility. If you're on a swing and listening to music, you can't sort of not be in your body, you know what I mean? Or if you're casting this shadow and making an interactive composition with the people around you, you're in physical space and you're in oral space and you're in visual space. And so there's a real sort of like particular sort of thing that play does around sort of really incarnating us. So I think it's a great tool. I think in some ways that's what listening is trying to do as well. You know, it's trying to bring us back to that, but play is sort of like takes it even further in a sense. You know, it really gives us an extra sort of piece of our toolkit. Maybe I'll pass that to Vincent.
So the way that I think about one way that I might think about interactivity in listening and the type of work that I do is, again, in the sound walk. I'll reference the idea of the sound walk. The sound walk is an interesting moment for listening, and it's been written about and theorized about. Hildegard Westerkamp is a Vancouver-based soundscape composer, ecologist, a mentor of mine, a good friend of mine, and she's talked at length about sound walking. So if anybody talks about sound walking, you're definitely thinking about the work that Hildegard has done. So so definitely, if you're interested in checking it out, follow up with that. But the one thing about sound walking and interactivity that's interesting is that if I were to do a sound walk, which is to say, if I just kind of took my earbuds out and went for a walk and dedicated myself to the next 30 minutes, I'd be listening intently. That is a very different experience than if I do that with 30 or 35 or 40 or 50 or 60 people, right? It becomes a completely different animal. When you're walking, and the most obvious reason why is because looking at 35 people walking in silence is weird. Like when does that happen? Why are they doing that? I led a sound walk earlier this year in March for a project I was working on, called Urban Imaginaries, and we did a Centertown sound walk, and there were about 35 of us who were walking around town, and we got the attention of pretty much everybody who we happened to walk past. It was in March. It was a beautiful day, so there were people out, and people would be looking at us, and I told everybody, I'm like, look, people are going to look at us. They're going to think we're weird. And it is going to look weird. We're 35 people walking through the city, not saying anything, dedicating our time and our attention to the sounds that surround us. It was an amazing experience. And then, of course, we debriefed, and everybody, commented on some of the people, or some people commented on some of the folks who noticed us. But I mean, it shapes how you listen. It shapes the experience. That's an interactive experience. And I couldn't have predicted that. I knew the route we were going to walk on, but I didn't know who was going to stop us where. I didn't know what was going to happen. These are sort of the risks that you run, but I don't know if they're risks, but they're the risks that you run when you talk about everyday sounds. Why? Because it's already always perfect, right? No, it is the way it is, the way it's supposed to be. Do you know what I mean? I mean, we can talk about design, clearly, but when we're thinking about and meditating on the sounds of everyday life, it's not worth lamenting that the train didn't pass at this time, that the car didn't come. It doesn't matter. It's already perfect. And that's kind of the point, right?
So do you think then silence plays any role in any of these soundscapes that you're trying to capture? I mean, sometimes I remember listening to a song, I forget which one right now. It was a Hindi song that I was listening to. And suddenly in the middle of the song, there was a pause. And I thought, okay, it was an uncomfortable pause because I knew the song is not over yet. And then suddenly the song picked up after that, but it, kind of piqued my interest, and I started listening to the song more when that pause happened. And I don't know if that kind of a device of absenting sound happened anywhere in any of your installations or work.
Well, silence is a sort of a charged concept, I think, and I, one of the things that struck me when I was doing the residency in the Brazilian Amazon is just how incredibly loud it is all the time, and you think of this sort of idyllic sort of natural landscape and we think of quiet. I guess I'm situating myself maybe in the north there with these long winters and whatnot, but it was amazing to be like, oh, this is incredibly dense and loud and there is no silence ever here, so that was one sort of revelation. Another thing that sort of immediately came up, sort of hearing you describe the Hindi song, is so Francisco Lopez, who led that residency and has been a sort of mentor of mine, one of the real revelatory things that I found in his work is his compositions almost always follow the same arc, and it's that they start in an extended silence. So you'll have his audience generally set up in sort of concentric circles, outward facing around him in the center. So there's no notion of sort of looking at a performer, and plus they're blindfolded. And the composition will start in silence, and they'll sort of be, a long sort of 5-minute stretch where there is no sort of line between, like, we're here to hear something that Francisco is playing, and this is the thing that he's playing, but he's not playing anything. And then he'll eventually sort of build the composition from there and build to these incredibly visceral, dense, powerful volumes. And then almost always cut to nothing, like abruptly. And the quality of that silence that follows that cut is like, I mean, I've got goosebumps just thinking about it. It's like nothing else, right? So what he's done there is mediated us with his composition, and our ears brought us to a place where he's revealing something in that silence afterwards that, ostensibly was there beforehand, but I didn't know was there beforehand. And it's an incredibly powerful device, and maybe on a different scale is what happens in that Hindi song, where you're brought somewhere and then all of a sudden a momentary pause, it's taken away, and you're feeling that space in a different way than you would have been had that song not preceded the silence.
Absolutely, beautifully said, David. Vincent, do you have any further thoughts on that?
No, not too many. Like, I don't know that I work with silence in the same way in the work that I do. The one thing that I would say about silence is, in that I guess maybe the one thing I would say about silence is in thinking about it maybe in a non-mediated context, sort of in the context of everyday life, is that, if we think about silence in our cities, silence is usually, there's a really important sort of socioeconomic dimension to it, right? Silence is something that people are seeking I mean, on a more philosophical level, we can talk about what do we mean by silence? Is there ever really silence? All of these things. We'll leave this discussion aside clearly. But if I'm thinking about the sounds of everyday life, there's an important sort of socioeconomic dimension to it, in that, you think about the cities, not North American, but cities all around the world. The most poor, the poorest parts of each city are oftentimes the loudest. And so silence is something that's very sought after when we think about property and real estate and urban design and all of the things. Look at Ottawa, and an undesirable place to live is right by the highway, all along that route. A more desirable place to live is a few blocks from the highway. And so silence becomes this thing that you could purchase in the context of the city. If you have the financial means to do so, you can live in a quieter neighborhood, right? So how does that make its way into a soundscape composition? I mean, there are many waiting to be made about that, and maybe something that I should do, but that's kind of what I think about at the moment when I'm thinking about silence.
Vincent, when you're talking about the city and the silence within the city, it reminds me of like every time there's a power outage here, I have trouble like sleeping and everything, because in my mind, like what I say is that the silence is deafening. Because at those moments when the power is out, all of those normal sounds that we hear, the humming of the fan, the computer vents, the like air conditioner, all of that's gone, and there is no silence. But all of the noises that I've been able to block out, like the highway that's a few blocks away, or like, and all of that, it's all I hear. And it really kind of brings me to that idea of what you're talking about earlier with the water dripping. That noise that was so distracting for you was the silence for everyone else. And that idea that, the sounds are our personal sounds, are the stories of what we are, but then it reverberates to the whole city. I guess maybe that's its selective silence. For Vincent, how does that relate to when you're recording those sounds of the city, and maybe specifically for Havana? How did, because I think you interpreted some of that in your recording of the local water. So.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, for sure. So, okay. So the one thing that I'd say is that the story that I can tell now about those sounds is not the story that I could tell in the moment that I was listening to those sounds, first of all, right? I heard those sounds and they pissed me off. I woke up every morning, they drip on my air conditioner 6:45 because the guy started the fill valve at 5 a.m. and it was about 6:45, an hour and 45 minutes before it overflowed and it started dripping on my thing. It was like 6:45. I can get another hour of sleep in here, but I never really did. I didn't know that it was immediate, that I could connect it so immediately to the sounds, to the infrastructural network of the city, to the degradation of the built environment, to the politics of the revolution that deprioritized cities over the interior of the island, that it connected it to the moment when the United States was the 6 decades that the United States spent there building up the infrastructure of the city to colonial Spain. Like I didn't do that. Like that's not what I heard, but that's the story, right? Like that's the story I want to tell about it, because these sounds are annoying and they're a consequence of that colonial history, right? Like we don't have dripping in our, I mean, some of us do, if we can't afford to fix it. Some of us have dripping in our houses and so on. But this, like, to me, the way I interpret those sounds is like this little sound is a consequence of these 500 years, right? And it's not that far off. Like I can make those connections, right? And so in the moment when I was listening to those sounds, it was just curious. Like I was just curious, like, why is it dripping here? And I heard a bunch of people yelling in the laneway. I had no idea what it was for, but I realized now that a lot of the yelling, well, some of the yelling was just people yelling at one another, but some of the yelling was also people just yelling, "Hey, turn off the water." And this really pointed me toward, like, holy cow, what a rich story in just sound and listening. Like, if I didn't listen, I would never have caught on that that this water points to that broken infrastructure, that these conversations in the laneway point to these people listening outside the limits of their own home, right? Like, I mean, and it seems like it's nothing. The way, like, it may seem like it's nothing, but I tell you, it's something, because when I got to Havana, my friend, he's like, okay, I'm going to come by, pick you up at 12 o'clock on Thursday. Okay, cool. It's 12 o'clock on Thursday. I'm just hanging out in my apartment. He comes up to my apartment. He doesn't have a phone to call me. He doesn't have, like, there's no doorbell. So he yells at me from outside. He's yelling, Vicente, Vicente. He's yelling at me. Why? Because that's how people communicate. Why? Because the windows and the doors, they're always open. I'm in my apartment and I don't realize it. Why? Because I don't listen to the sounds of the street, because I don't think anybody's going to be calling my name. You know, like, that's not, we don't do that here. If somebody's coming to my house, they're going to send me a text and they'll be like, hey man, I'm outside, come outside, or they'll call me. But, like, so I'm not attuned to listening outside of my window just in an everyday way. But the magic of that sequence is that these residents are. They do listen outside their window, and that's just a normal way of listening. Do you follow? And so it's completely different than the way that we listen. And so for that reason, I'm like, holy cow, this is something, like, there's something really interesting happening here. So I went and I recorded all these sounds piece by piece. I have every last little bit of the sound, the sort of sequence. And once I had that, then I could say, okay, why is this happening? And that's how I thought outward. Then you do the work, right? Then you do the history. So that's kind of how that came together. All of this is to say, and I'll end it here, all of this is to say, we can listen to the same sound in different ways over time, right? I've learned to listen to that dripping sound in a very different way today than I did a few years ago when I encountered it, right? And this is the magic of our recordings and the work we do, because we can come back to those recordings years later with very different ears, right?
I wanted to direct kind of that last thought to David, because of the Amazon project. And then, so when you're talking about recording at the Amazon and how the sounds were just so like overpowering, and then the project that you connected them to later with the earbuds, what was it called? Once removed sound. I feel like that relates a lot to this idea about, like, in the moment, you would never be able to imagine it in that way, of these removed sounds. And this connects a lot to your other work too, where you've taken sound of a place and then removed it to a different location entirely. How do you feel like when you're first listening to the sounds for those projects? Did you know what the end result was, or how did you finally connect to that once removed locations?
I certainly was not conceiving of placing those Amazonian soundscapes in 400 earbuds in an art gallery as I was recording them, and I think we touched on this a bit earlier, but I think those of us sort of working in this medium are always up against that notion of removal, right? Which is kind of embedded in the history of sound recording. Are we taking something and putting it somewhere else? And there's sort of a long theoretical history there. And I think in part I wanted to push back against that in some ways. It never would have occurred to me probably 5 years earlier to put that sort of rich, delicate, natural soundscape in a bunch of shitty plastic earbuds in a gallery. It just would have seemed sacrilegious. And part of it was, sort of a pushback against that, and sort of saying, actually, what would happen if we did this? And think about these sort of point source that we're using in our everyday lives, right? We've got these tiny little sound making things that produce about as much sound as one of those Amazonian insects would, if you just let it sort of hang there and play at full volume. And then, you know, I think part of that process for me, again, was about not necessarily having the answer to that, saying how will people engage with that? How will they respond to that? And the curator of that particular series, Eric Mattson, had actually done some time in the Amazon, sort of listening and recording. And he said, you know, he was wary at first, but then when he experienced that piece and the way that it made him listen, and sort of your head is literally kind of moving through these earbuds. And he said, it's actually the closest approximation that I've ever had to that experience of being in that Amazonian listening situation, which is certainly not a result that I could have predicted. And that sort of wasn't even an intention necessarily at the beginning, you know, but it emerged through that process, and other questions emerged with it. I think that maybe diverted a little from your original question, but yeah.
It's always nice when the questions get diverted. It brings out more ideas. So at this point, do either of you have any questions for each other or comments about each other's work? David, you unmuted. Do you have any comments or questions at this point for Vincent?
Yeah. Okay. So they're still somewhat unformed, but let's just go for it. I think one thing that jumped out at me in your presentation, that Doreen Massey quote that you brought out, which was wonderful, but she has a notion in there of places as moments. I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, and I'm wondering. You know, a huge question that comes into the work of anyone who's working with sound is temporality, right? And I'm sort of wondering how you're thinking about those notions of sound in its sort of time-based existence.
Yeah, it's a good question. So she does refer to what her aim is in that quote, is saying effectively that our experience of place is limited because it's influenced by all of these other things, these other sort of social narratives, historical and spatial, that are brought to bear on who we are and how we experience this place in this moment. They're abstract, they're things that we can't really see, we can't really hear, but it's only because of them that we experience this space in the way that in the ways that we do, right? So hers is like the general gist is that she's saying there's a lot more to the story. There's a lot more to the story of place, and thinking about this moment as one that's circumscribed both spatially and temporally is key if we're going to understand what this thing really is. Right, and we have to see it and hear it as that. So that's kind of the gist, and that's kind of what I took in my experience in Havana, for instance. That one example, it's like there's this thing that I'm hearing and this sequence, and it's like, but there's more to it. And so what's that more? And so ways of reaching toward that more is through that idea of the outward soundingness, which I just kind of like flipped her idea of the outward lookingness of space on its head, right? But I also asked those questions like, you know, I really love asking questions. I think this is my point of departure when I start thinking about sound in space, which is, you know, sounds, they come and they go. And this is why people have such a difficult time with it, right? It's like, well, the minute you hear a sound, it's gone. And sounds, they don't return. But But if you step back, there are rhythms, right? It's like, well, we know that I'm going to hear a lot more traffic on my street at about between 7 and 9 every morning, right? And I know and I know that'll happen between Monday and Friday, and that won't happen on Saturday and Sunday, right? And so there are these sort of macro rhythms of sort of the soundscape that I think we can attune ourselves to. Some months are louder than other months. Some months the park nearby my place is Commissioner's Park, or the Confederation Park, Dow's Lake. There's a lot of people there, June through September, but in winter, you don't hear people. So there's like these annual rhythms, right, that you can think about. So there's that. And then there's the question that, I ask that I really think kind of sets me in motion, which is like, okay, so how old is this sound? And I love the poetry in it, right? Because sounds come and they go. But some sounds can be heard in some places a lot longer than other sounds, right? We walk over to, in Vancouver, where I lived for a decade, the sounds of water along the coast there, those are old sounds, the sounds of water along the coast of most any city that's been a coastal city, they're old sounds, right? We can trust that the people who were here before us centuries and centuries and centuries ago also heard those sounds, right? So this is a wonderful question to ask. How old is this sound? How long has it lived here, right? How long has that dripping sound lived in that room? It predated me, but didn't predate the 1950s. I could tell you that, right? So I think that's and I think those questions of historicity and spatiality set the whole thing in motion. Once you start answering those questions, then the train is running, Yeah.
Do you think that there's something inherent in the fact that sound is by nature time-based that lends itself more to that connection to historicity than the visual? Is there, these are speculative things, but.
Yeah. I don't know if there's something, that's a great question. I don't know if there's something more or less, but there's something different. And because sound, I'm going to guess that because sound is ephemeral, I think people have a harder time dealing with it. People have a harder time working with it, right? But anybody could do it. Like anybody, if you have a fully functioning auditory system, and even if you don't, I think you can still find ways to do it. It's not like this magical thing. Like even it's like, I don't know, David, you play guitar, you play instruments. Like when I used to be a drum teacher for many years, and people would just be like, I just don't have any rhythm. It's like, no, you can figure this out, and I'll show you how you can figure this out. You need time and effort and practice and dedication and all the things, and you can figure it out. And I don't think it's different. And half of playing any instrument is listening anyway. So like developing your oral awareness, like we could all do this. It's just for whatever reason, sound is this thing that people are like, whoa, I don't know if I could, I can't see it. It's like, I have a tough time around it. So yeah. And if I might, I also have a question for David. David, so in fact, I have more than a question, but I'm going to ask one question because it's easier that way. So one question I have, one question I was thinking about as you work through some of the examples of works that you'd put together was, I got the sense that there were some projects that you'd probably feel a little bit more comfortable working on. For instance, the work that you did in Montreal, or maybe some of the work that you do, I don't know, a project that you had an inspiration for, or a project that maybe you do in your own home city or in Ottawa, something that it's an environment you're comfortable in, it's your own home environment, potentially, your neighborhood, your city, you feel comfortable in this environment. Whereas I think my guess is that working in a foreign environment, so you're working in the Amazon in particular, an environment that's not your own, an environment that has a lot of that's politically charged for a lot of reasons. How did your approach as an artist change? Did your approach as an artist change between how you would work with sounds in your own home city, or in Montreal, for instance, which was your home city, presumably when you were doing your MA, and a space like the Amazon, which, I don't know, I mean, maybe some of the sounds you recorded are not going to be around in, like, 15 years, maybe 5, maybe they're not around anymore, and so I think there's like a really, really important politics to that work that that's worth maybe kind of opening up and speaking to.
Yeah, I think when I'm working on a piece like Hearing There, which was the Montreal piece, there's a whole other level of sort of personal cultural investment. I was born in Montreal. I grew up in Montreal. I've lived on or around Saint Laurent Boulevard for 20 plus years. So it's a space that's connected to my story, right, in lots of ways. When I went down to the Amazon, I was entirely as removed potentially as I could be from that story. And I think one of the ways that I approached working and recording in the Amazon was sort of a level of a different kind of, there are a lot of sort of charged ways of thinking about it, but a different respect for the spaces and the sounds that I was recording and collecting. So in Montreal, it was often very hands-on, interviews, binaural recordings on the street. And one of the things that I was often doing in Amazon was sort of, I would actually sort of set up a recording kit and just leave and come back a couple of hours later. And whatever had happened there, I would then listen to, kind of thing. So I was not sort of forcefully present in the space in the same way that I would have been in the Montreal context. It's not, I don't have probably the same kinds of political lenses around my work that you will have around your work, just because of sort of differences in backgrounds and whatnot. But does that maybe give you a sense of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I can only imagine that, yeah, like pushing record with your recorder felt different. That's my guess, is that it would have felt different in the Amazon than it feels, walking up Saint Laurent or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. It very much felt different, and there was very much that sense of I'm not sort of here to record my presence here, whereas in Montreal there was a sense of that. My presence was integral to a lot of that work, and in the Amazon, my presence actually was a nuisance to the place itself, right? And sort of, how do I deal with that? How do I sort of deal with that in practice and sort of create an awareness of that in the way that the recordings come out and whatnot? And it's tricky. And that does come up in lots of different contexts. Lots of different political contexts emerge in various ways on various projects, for sure.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, thanks for that.
As so due to time, I'm going to start to wrap things up. I have multiple other questions or inquiry, but I'm going to hold it there. And one thing that I wanted to say is just how interesting it is. I feel like a lot of our conversation focused on the recording, but there was also and listening, so the recording and its connection to listening, but there's also in the creation, which is kind of affecting how others will listen and engage, and then the like moving of the sound to other locations. And those are things that perhaps will be a future conversation more. And I feel like whenever, as I said before, sound's not the thing that I normally think of, but when both of you are talking about it, it really reminds me how important it is and how immersive it can be. And when I'm telling stories through images, and I'm always thinking of exactly the things that you guys talking about, of the layering and the connection to place. And so I think it's really important to have this other layer of sound. So I wanted to thank both of you very much for being here today. It's a very, very good conversation. The recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube for people to share and engage with later. And thank you very much. Pallavi, do you have anything else to add?
No, just a heartfelt thanks to both of you. And this was a lovely conversation and quite a different perspective on the normal, very ocular-centric discussions that we have. So it's having this, auditory angle to it is amazing. And thank you both for sharing your works with us. We do have our last webinar coming up on July 28th, so please log in then. And do you have any closing remarks, Vincent and David?
For me, nothing beyond thanks to both of you, Pallavi and Katie, for the invite. I mean, this was fantastic. I'm happy to be able to come here and do this with you, and David as well. David, thanks for sharing your work, and it's been an awesome conversation, and also getting to know more about your portfolio and what it is you do professionally. That's awesome. Thank you to all three of you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Katie and Pallavi, and Vincent. It's great for me to sort of engage in a different way with some of these questions around sound that are in many ways very similar, but also your thinking opens me up to myriad questions that connect to my work as well in different ways. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks. So on that, we hope to see people at the next webinar, and have a great rest of summer. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.